Hey guys, I don't usually do shorter breaking news videos. However, in this circumstance, as it affects the news content on this channel going forward, and it's of significant magnitude, I felt the need to make a short video update. And as such, before we go into the meat of the problem today, which is of course Putin mobilizing the active reserves, we'll go in with a general follow-on from my last report, which you should be able to find on my channel, the one I made last week after the counter-offensive. And let's start with that. The offensive in Karkif has been a confirmed success, with Ukrainians digging in on several bridgeheads the other side of the Oskil and Donets rivers. The major piece of news from this region, as a result of the counter-offensive, is the confirmation that the units that were defending against the Ukrainian attack near Karkif were none other than Putin's most elite formation from the Moscow military district, 1st Guards Tank Army, who suffered significant personnel losses in both killed and wounded. However, equipment losses are really where it stings for the Russians, with the Ukrainians capturing entire ammunition dumps and vehicle parks intact, including several examples of Russia's most advanced frontline main battle tank in Ukraine, the T-90M, and they captured it in perfect working order. I have a feeling that they are even now on trucks to Germany as we speak. And before we get those Russian bots in the comments and all those stupid idiots like, actually the Armata is the most powerful Russian tank. Yes, I know the Armata platform is the most advanced tank in the Russian arsenal, but like all Russian vanity projects, there aren't many in service, and those that are most likely have huge overheads and terrible teething problems. Plus, they aren't risking them in actual combat. So, it doesn't count. All in all, we have 67 confirmed T-80s and T-90s destroyed or captured, with evidence to support perhaps 40 more, both in operational and combat losses. As for personnel, there are estimates between 400 to 1,000 in total casualties for 1st Guards Tank Army, killed, wounded and captured. In terms of total losses, Oryx sits at around 400 vehicles of all types captured in the offensive, including self-propelled artillery, tanks, armoured personnel carriers, IFVs, MRAPs, trucks, and assorted military materiel. But the most telling part of all this is they weren't abandoned combat losses. They weren't damaged vehicles that threw a track and then they just abandoned them in the field or something. No. These were captured outright in working condition, along with the munitions dumps to arm them. The Ukrainian Armed Forces' official statement on this was, "We don't accept gifts from murderous occupiers, so we shall return everything we found." Even as this announcement was made, my comrades in the team of NAFO, the North Atlantic Fellows Organization, edited 1st Guards Tank Army's Wikipedia page to entirely past tense and changed its nominal strength to 4 tanks. Wikipedia changed it back, but not before I screenshotted it, as seen here. But yes, with the success of the Karkif Counter-Offensive, the Ukrainians have crossed the Donets and Oskil rivers, digging in and establishing bridgeheads. And in a rather piece of dark comedy, one of the bridgeheads they've secured is the same one where they massacred several Russian battalion tactical groups during the Russian Donbass offensive in May. However, where the Russians failed, the Ukrainians have succeeded. They have crossed the bridges in good order and are in the process of digging in, halting their offensive at a natural barrier while keeping their offensive options open, waiting for their logistics framework to be established and supply lines set up before attempting another offensive move. You know, like competent armies do. It also frees up their operational maneuver group, comprised of their elite infantry units from the air assault brigades and Task Force Kraken, to launch spoiling attacks in the central southern region towards Melitopol, or to give the assault on Kherson a high-quality reserve. To quote American General Omar Bradley, one of the finest commanders of World War II, "Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics." It's all about the correlation and concentration of forces while keeping them in manpower, munitions, and most importantly, MREs. Beans, bullets, and bombs. And it's this calculation that is giving the Ukrainians the ability to maintain their advance on Kherson. The southern offensive is proceeding steadily. Ground is being retaken, but it is a much more methodical and brutal affair, with both sides pouring men and materiel into the maelstrom. Casualties on both sides have been heavy, and exact numbers are not available to the public, but evidence suggests that the Ukrainians have been trading personnel for position, digging trenches to advance, concentrating artillery, drone strikes, and their limited close air support assets on Russian strongpoints. The VDV and what remains of the Guards' tank formations are holding them at bay for now. But once again, the Ukrainians have been blowing the bridges across the Dnieper, choking their supply lines. The Russians are losing a lot of men and equipment, as are the Ukrainians. Both sides are hemorrhaging forces. The difference is the Ukrainians have the men, more equipment of superior quality thanks to NATO, and local force superiority. This is not the tactical and strategic elan of Rommel or Patton that we saw up north in Kharkiv. This is Montgomery or Model, or rather ironically, Zhukov. The Ukrainians have concentrated interior lines, a NATO border with Romania nearby, and secure highways to Kyiv and Lviv. Russia, meanwhile, has to drive across hostile territory all the way from the eastern Donbass, or from the Caucasus and Crimea via the sea or the Kerch Bridge. And then they only have 1 or 2 bridges still standing to feed supplies into the battle. They are unable to get enough of what they need to the front, while the Ukrainians can. And if they try to retreat, they'll all be bottled up and slaughtered on the riverbank. And so, they have placed their Class A units in the area and have resolved to stand. Ukrainian forces are now less than 15 kilometers or under 10 miles away from Kherson proper. The fight has been and will be a bloody one, but wars of liberation often are. Their goal, in my estimation, is to retake the city before winter in order to unify the Dnieper River front where they can dig in and wait out the horrible weather. To call that task a hard one would of course be an understatement. However, given the circumstances now, I think it is accurate to invoke the words of the Prussian cavalry officer Friedrich von Bredow during one of the largest battles of the Franco-Prussian War. It will cost what it will cost. But that cost is sadly not borne solely by the soldiers at the front. Details are still coming out, and due to YouTube and of course human decency, I won't show any of the pictures I have been seeing. But mass graves have been found in the liberated areas, the largest one being near the city of Izium, where over 400 people were found, some of them with evidence of torture, some of them children. I wish I could say I was surprised by this, but after the revelations at Bucha, and following the track record of Russia throughout its history from Katyn to Chechnya to Georgia, the best way I've heard it described is horrified, but not surprised. These graves have been supplemented by other draconian Russian occupation measures, with local police stations and prisons being turned into modern gulags, with local people detained as political prisoners, with over 10 men confined to a one-man cell such as the one seen on screen here. The Lord's Prayer is in Ukrainian etched into the wall on the right-hand side. The scenes we've seen as towns were liberated say everything we need to know about life in the occupied zones. Unlike what Putin's propagandists told his army of conquest, these men are greeted as an army of freedom. Scenes we really haven't seen since the liberation of Europe from Nazism almost 80 years ago. But as I suspected, these Ukrainian victories would not go unanswered. The offensive on Kherson's slow but significant success, along with the rapid victories in Kharkiv Oblast, pose a clear and present danger to Russian national security for the very first time in this war, and that is something that Putin's regime cannot allow. The entire reason for this war began in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea after the overthrow of Russia's puppet government in Kyiv threatened the security of Sevastopol's naval installations, the main base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet since the reign of Catherine the Great. The Donbass and imperial restoration are but grander goals justifying Putin's ideological position. In a purely material sense, Crimea and its strategic importance was and is the number one concern of the Russians from day one of this conflict, started almost 10 years ago. With the retaking of Karkif Oblast, this puts some of Ukraine's best and most mobile forces on the border with the Russian interior. And with the damage done to 1st Guards Tank Army, this leaves the Moscow military district under direct threat, while simultaneously the offensive towards Kherson is achieving steady gains while inflicting casualties that in the short term the Russians can't replace or resupply, but the Ukrainians can. But more importantly, should those forces around Kherson be destroyed or forced back, and should the Ukrainians retake the city with a bridgehead over the Dnieper, this puts a large Ukrainian army group with a complete logistical framework less than an hour's drive from the Tatar Ditch, the entrance to Crimea, territory which, while rightfully Ukraine's, according to Moscow, is officially part of Russia. With Crimea under threat and personnel crises amongst frontline units, Putin has now taken the step to call partial mobilization, meaning all active reservists, that is, people who have just finished their mandatory military service or people who were in the professional military for a period of time, are being called back to duty. Approximately 300,000 men at this time. At the same time, due to this mobilization call, all active duty personnel have had their enlistments confirmed for the duration of the special military operation, which means that all the soldiers who signed contracts to join the war are now in it for the long haul, whether they like it or not. Veterans in the comments section can reinforce to the civilians in the comments section just how much stop-loss sucks. And for the Russians, it's worse, because given the economic trouble Russia is in right now, I doubt their payments will get higher. So the big question is, why is it happening, and how will it go? Well, as my colleague Perrin says, who no doubt will be able to cast some more light on this as it develops, we can't precisely be sure at the moment, but I'll go through what we do know and what we can piece together. First, as mentioned before, the Karkif Counter-Offensive was a stunning success, resulting in considerable damage to 1st Guard's tank army, as well as the capture of advanced Russian gear, including a T-90M and an intact Russian electronic warfare pod, which could potentially compromise the electronic warfare capability of the entire Russian frontline fighter force. As I said before, both pieces of equipment are almost certainly in American hands in Germany right now. Speaking of, Russian air casualties have also been high in an attempt to stop the ongoing offensive on Kherson, while achieving practically nothing, losing up to 7 aircraft in the past few days. That offensive on Kherson, meanwhile, has been effective in drawing the Russians into a war of attrition, which, due to the supply interdiction strikes with HIMARS against munition dumps, supply points, and bridge crossings across the Dnieper, along with the local superiority of Ukrainian manpower, the offensive looks set to liberate the city, with Ukrainian units less than 10 miles from the city. But crucially, it threatens the security of Crimea, which, as I said before, is an unacceptable risk to Russian strategic interests, given that it was this whole reason the war started, and Black Sea Fleet and all of its support infrastructure is there. Losing their bases, both air and naval, on the Crimean Peninsula, let alone the political fallout and the loss of face, would be unacceptable. Furthermore, with the defeat of 1st Guard's tank and the liberation of Kharkiv Oblast, Ukrainian air assault regiments, Task Force Kraken, and several tank brigades are now emplaced on the Russian border, occupying the 2 main highways that, if Ukraine were to decide to invade Russia, lead directly to Moscow. And right now, they really don't have any formations in the Moscow military district that could stop them if they tried. This is unacceptable. The Russians collectively, since their earliest history, have always had one chronic fear, one constant boogeyman, that being the foreign invader. From the Teutonic Knights facing down Alexander Nevsky, to the Huns and the Mongols of the eastern steppes, to Napoleon sacking Moscow, and most culturally important of all, the genocidal march of the Third Reich, Russia has always had one major geopolitical goal above all others: build a barrier between them and their potential enemies. Their multiple invasions of all of Eastern Europe, the Russo-Japanese War, the establishment of the Warsaw Pact, and even their current invasion of Ukraine right now, the primary underlying strategic goal in almost every move they make on a geopolitical stage is building a buffer between them and a potential threat. And now they have a NATO-backed army, fueled by the rage that only an oppressed subject feels, less than a day's drive from Moscow. I would say that most likely the feeling in Moscow and among the Russian leadership at this point is panic. The next factor is, of course, obviously personnel losses in general. That doesn't require too much explanation. Ukraine reports 50,000 Russian KIA. Western intelligence estimates 50,000 casualties in total, that's killed, wounded, and captured. The Russians need more bodies, especially to fill out their logistics chain, which has suffered very heavily. They started the war with around 150,000 men. To take 34% casualties of a total force is absolutely devastating. What's worse is the troops that have been fighting there have been fighting for over 6 months without leave. Their entire contract has been spent in combat. Morale is in the toilet, losses are high, and victory is nowhere in sight. Without fresh troops, Moscow's ability to recoup combat power is less than nil, And finally, we have the political element. Putin has major issues from political factions in Russia, pushing for all-out war with Ukraine. The nationalist factions on both the left and the right have been asking for mobilization. And what's worse is that the Russian far-right has been perpetuating a variant of the stabbed-in-the-back myth, claiming that their armed forces are the mightiest on the face of the earth, and the only thing that could cause their defeat would be betrayal from the highest levels. Given the justification for invading Ukraine was denazification, using Nazi talking points kinda reveals your true intentions here, guys. Just so you know. Multiple members of the Duma have called the war a defeat, with many calling for Putin's resignation. By calling for mobilization, to some extent, he placates the hardline militarists and the nationalists while addressing the military reality of Russia's defeat in the field. He gets more men into the army, and he keeps the hardliners from going nuts. However, if you examine the law closely, and some experts have, it shows that this partial mobilization can in fact be increased steadily into a full mobilization should the situation further deteriorate. So Russia is essentially preparing to mobilize all of its reserves. But there are several major issues with mobilization that the Russians face. First, equipment losses in Ukraine, alongside the loss of trained personnel, have been devastating. Russia has lost a considerable amount of its modern frontline military equipment, and to maintain unit strength, they drew replacement personnel from training units. The 300,000 men they are raising while being active reservists, that being personnel who have recently finished military service or were former professional active duty, will still need refresher courses to bring them back up to combat readiness, along with further training specific to the operations they will be undertaking in the Ukrainian theatre. And that is under the assumption that the Russian army will actually train their men properly, which current evidence suggests they probably won't. They didn't prior to the invasion, and with shortages in manpower, those already cut corners will be cut even more. Furthermore, the 150 to 200,000 Russian troops currently stationed in Ukraine have been in constant combat since the invasion, and subsequent campaign began. No leave, no break, nothing but constant combat. Those troops are exhausted and morale is terrible. They don't have the motivation of liberating a homeland or protecting their families. The goodwill they have to their leadership is tenuous as it is, and right now, they've all had their contracts extended for the duration of the war. They're not happy. The recently raised conscripts will almost certainly be used to rotate soldiers out for the winter, or to shore up battalion tactical groups who have not been in country as long as the other units who need refit. The number of replacements they are bringing in will also be a lower quality as time goes on, and it won't be enough to give them force superiority over the current Ukrainian opposition. And that's assuming everyone shows up for the draft, which initial evidence suggests won't be the case. Protests broke out across Russia's major cities today against mobilization, while flights out of the country and land border crossings completely sold out almost immediately. Everyone's trying to dodge the draft. They're trying to get out of it. But even if they can get everyone they need, even if they can train them, even if they can get them into Ukraine, the next question is, what will they fight with? We've already seen T-62s reactivated from Russian reserve stocks, D-30 howitzers from the height of the Soviet Union. We've got BTR-60s already in extensive use, as well as original model BRDMs. We've seen the separatist formations armed with Mosin-Nagant rifles and DP-28s. If these reservists are used to form or reinforce combat units in whole, the gear they'll be issued will more than likely be far older equipment of dubious utility and quality. I'm half expecting to see the T-34-85 make its triumphant return to the Eastern Front, which admittedly would be pretty metal. I'd think it'd be pretty cool for the 5 seconds they're alive before an AT-4 pops the turret off. Then there is the lead time on those replacements. You need to assemble everyone, which will take weeks. You then need to retrain them and re-equip them, another few weeks. You then need to ship them to the front, assign them to units, rotate the old guys out, file the paperwork, organize food and housing for them. The logistics chain to support 300,000 people is a massive operation, something the Russians haven't exactly demonstrated proficiency in. And unless they get those 300,000 people in right the fuck now, they're not going to be much help to them to stop this counter-offensive on Kherson at any rate. And as always, when confronted with the fact that they have now started visibly losing the war, Putin has threatened nuclear retaliation against NATO, blaming the West for all of their setbacks, and that the full might of Russia will very soon be brought to bear. However, by now, as the Baltic states, Poland, Finland, and Sweden have made clear, they aren't afraid of Russia anymore, and they won't be intimidated, and neither will we. If they want to start a fight, NATO will most definitely finish it. However, there is a better way. A better way I hope these actions by Putin will soon bring to the fore. A long time ago, a Tsar of the Russias, who led his country into a horrific and futile war, found himself without a crown before that war was over, at the hands of his own people. It's a hope that may be forlorn. Perhaps the Russian people aren't motivated to do it. Maybe they have accepted their role in this calamity of humanity. But it's nice to hope. In any case, we in the West who aren't directly involved in the fighting, who aren't already providing logistical support, have to do our part as well. The only way that we will be able to defeat the tyranny of Russia and its government is to combat the propaganda and suppression of people both in their own country and abroad. We must fight the information war against Russia with every method available to us, supporting those brave Ukrainians who are fighting in the field for the liberation of their home. Therefore, to that end, I will once again leave you with the words of a greater man than I will ever be, and simply say, Slava Ukraina, and see you next time.
Ladies and gentlemen, we decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. No president should fear public scrutiny of his program, for from that scrutiny comes understanding, and from that understanding comes support or opposition, and both are necessary. For I have complete confidence in the response and dedication of our citizens whenever they are fully informed. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment, the only business in America specifically protected by the Constitution not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and the sentimental, not to simply give the public what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mold, educate, and sometimes even anger public opinion. This means greater coverage and analysis of international news, for it is no longer far away and foreign, but close at hand and local. It means greater attention to improved understanding of the news, as well as improved transmission. And it means, finally, that government at all levels must meet its obligation to provide you with the fullest possible information outside the narrowest limits of national security. And so it is to the printing press, to the recorder of man's deeds, the keeper of his conscience, the courier of his news, that we look for strength and assistance, confident that with your help, man will be what he was born to be, free and independent.